Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to golems and astral projection.
Yeah, consciousness.
But as always, we have to get there. This week's rabbit hole is dedicated in honor of nobody, or maybe everybody. If you'd like to dedicate an upcoming episode of the Parshah Rabbit Hole or make a small donation to help me keep on digging, go to creativejudaism.com/donate. Okay, let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Vayakhel, tells us all about the construction of the mishkan, the portable temple that the Jews used until the permanent temple was built in Jerusalem. Most of the Parsha is a repetition of instructions that Hashem gave to Moshe or Moses in the last few Torah portions, but in this week's Parsha we're told about those things actually being implemented.
Creating a design is one thing, making it work mechanically, surely, safely is another.
And one of those details that's mentioned in last week's Parsha and then repeated again in this week's Parsha is the name of the artist who is in charge of the creation of all of the intricate elements of the Mishkan, Betzalel. As a Jewish artist myself, there's a special place in my heart for Betzalel and his team of craftspeople.
Right up in here, we'll make a happy little cloud.
I like to think that if I had lived in that time, I might have been one of them, but honestly, I'm not great at following instructions, so probably not. But regardless of whether or not Betzalel would have wanted me on his team, I knew as soon as I started working on this episode that I wanted Betzalel to be on this Rabbit Holes team. I wanted it to be about him. But it didn't go where I thought it would. What I wanted to try to do was find a connection to onions. The word Betzalel in Hebrew means onion, so I was hoping that I could find a Jewish source that says that the name Betzalel means onion of God.
Dear God, thank you for this venison. Onion God, thank you for these onions.
And then from there, I'm sure I would have been able to find all sorts of cool onion-related stuff to explore. But it didn't work out that way. I tried searching for Betzalel onion, and there were only a few search results and nothing from any real Torah sources. And what made it harder is that the actual meaning of the name Betzalel that's mentioned all over the place comes from the word Betzalel, in the shadow of God. And Betzalel, in the shadow, is spelled exactly the same way as Butzel, onion. So every time I searched for the Hebrew words, I just got results about shadows and not onions. But I decided to follow the threads that I did find, and it took me to some very interesting places. First, let's look at the Talmud's explanation of the name Betzalel. It says that Betzalel is a reference to his wisdom. Hashem told Moshe to tell Betzalel to make a mishkan, the ark, and the utensils. But when Moshe relayed that information to Betzalel, he reversed the order and said, make the ark, the utensils, and the mishkan. So this is a reference to the fact that the order of how things are listed in the verses where God gives Moshe all the instructions is different to the order that they're listed in our Parsha when they're actually made.
It is reversed as ordered, Creator.
So the Gemara continues and says that Betzalel responded to this by saying, Moshe Rabbeinu, the way things normally work is that first you build a house and then you put the utensils in the house. But you told me, make an ark and utensils and then the mishkan. In which case, once I make the utensils, where should I put them? Maybe Hashem told you make the mishkan, the ark, and then the utensils. To which Moshe Rabbeinu responded, maybe you were in the shadow of God, Betzalel, and that's how you knew what Hashem actually said to me. Okay, so that's a very cool story, and we're going to get back to it a little bit later. But once I found this, what was really interesting to me was what the Gemara says right after this. The Gemara is explaining a verse from last week's Parsha, Parshas Kisisa, but that verse actually gets repeated almost word for word in this week's Parsha when Moshe relays it to the Jewish people. In the verse, God says, Va'amale oisei ruach elikim bechachma, besvuna, uvedas, uvechol malacha. I have filled him with divine spirit, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all types of craft. So, based on this, the Gemara says that Betzalel knew how to join the letters with which heaven and earth were created. And the Gemara's proof for this is those words in that verse that describe Betzalel, bechachma, bisvuna, uvedas, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge. And those same three words are used in Mishlei, or Proverbs, to describe how Hashem created the world. So based on that, the Gemara says that Betzalel had this ability to use the words and letters of creation to create things himself. So this is already very fascinating to me, that the Gemara describes Betzalel's particular type of artistic talent as being similar to God's creation of the world. Again, as an artist, this idea is very exciting. I don't know if this is something that regular artists can hope to emulate in some small way, or if it's something that's completely unique to Betzalel. I assume that since it's part of Torah, there must be something in it that I can apply personally. So this is where the rabbit hole starts, with Betzalel, the archetypal Jewish artist, and his ability to manipulate the letters through which God created the world. If you're ready to see where that goes, let's dive in. So I started looking at the commentaries on that Gemara to get more insight into this idea of Betzalel being able to manipulate the letters of creation. And I started with Rashi, and it ended up taking me down a path I didn't expect. Rashi explains that the world was created by the divine combination and permutations of letters, and that how this is done is described in Sefer Yetzirah.
There's something you didn't tell me about the contents of the Sefer Yetzirah.
So Sefer Yetzirah, literally translated as the Book of Formation, is the oldest book of Jewish mysticism, and according to Jewish tradition, it was written by Avram Avinu, or Abraham. So the reason this jumped out at me, that Rashi described Betzalel's letter combination powers as being the method of creation described in Sefer Yetzirah, is because in Jewish lore, that's how a golem is created.
These pages, they're basically instructions for animating the inanimate.
If you don't know, a golem is a creature that's a human form made from clay or mud that's brought to life through methods described in Sefer Yetzirah. But the golem isn't even called a golem until much later in Jewish history. In earlier sources, this creature is simply called a man created through Sefer Yetzirah. The earliest golem stories, as far as I can tell, are two very short stories that appear back-to-back in Gemara. Here's the first one. Rav Chanina and Rav Oishia would get together every Friday, Erev Shabbos, and they would learn Sefer Yetzirah, and a fully grown calf would emerge, and then they would eat it on Shabbos. So, a few wonderful things about this story. First of all, it illustrates the Sefer Yetzirah connection. Second, it's cool that it's a golem cow. In all the stories I've heard, the golem is almost always a humanoid, so it's very cool to think about it being possible to make a golem in the form of anything. And the last wonderful thing that jumped out at me about this story is that they ate it! They ate the golem cow! Usually, in artistic representations of the golem, even when it's animated and moving around, it still looks like a lump of mud or clay.
A rabbi created this magic creature out of humble clay.
So it's cool to think that whatever animating force brings a golem to life also changes the substance of it to make it similar to the thing that it's supposed to be. In this case, a delicious cow. And one more thing that jumped out at me about this story is that this may very well be the most ethical way to get veal. Okay, next story, which is actually the first story. It comes before the golem cow story, but I wanted to tell the golem cow story first because it mentions Sefer Yetzirah specifically. Anyways, here's the next story, or the first story. Rava created a man and sent it to Rav Zera. Rav Zera spoke to it, but it didn't reply. So Rav Zera said, "You were created by one of my friends. Return to your dust." So Rav Zera recognized that this was a golem because it didn't speak to him, and he immediately destroyed it. He made it go back to being an inanimate pile of dust. So again, another delightful golem story. This one is particularly interesting to me for two reasons. First, Rav Zera apparently had really good golem detection skills. And it makes me think that maybe this was something that the rabbis of the Talmud did to each other, like all the time. That'd be fun. But I think one of the most notable things about this story is that it establishes an element of golem lore which is now ubiquitous, that a golem can't speak.
Finally, I can talk. This is the voice I've got. Sounds like I should be selling egg creams in Brighton Beach.
So even though the Gemara doesn't mention Sefer Yetzirah in this story, Rashi does. He explains that Rava created this man through combinations of the letters of the name of God as taught in Sefer Yetzirah. Okay, so the whole reason we're talking about this is because of Betzalel. I wanted to see if there was any connection between Betzalel's Sefer Yetzirah letter combination creation powers and the golem. So I did some digging, and I found one place, a Rishima from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that mentions the two together. As I've mentioned before, the Rishimas are the Rebbe's personal notes, and most of them are written in a shorthand that can sometimes be challenging to follow. This one in particular contains a lot of brief thoughts and questions about the topic of how human thought is not comparable to God's thought, because God's thought has the power to create and human thought doesn't. So the Rebbe goes through a few examples of different instances that might challenge this distinction. And at one point he brings two examples together to ask one question. Rava creating a man in that Gemara that we just looked at, and Betzalel's ability to create through the power of combining letters. And then he asks a question which he doesn't answer. Was this specifically through speech? As I said, this is written in shorthand, but if you read between the lines, the question is, did Rava and Betzalel specifically need to use speech in order to create using Sefer Yetzirah letter combination power? In which case that would just be an example of how human speech can cause physical outcomes, which isn't anything new. Or could they do it just by thinking? In which case that would be an example of how human thought could cause a physical outcome, which would make it seem like human thought is similar to God's thought, and then that would be a question that would need further examination. Like I said, the Rebbe leaves this question unanswered. But it does make the Betzalel Golem connection that I was looking for, and it tells us that, at least in a certain context, they're in the same category, which is very cool to me. And the reason why that's cool to me, that Betzalel's Sefer Yetzirah letter combination powers might be the same as Golem's Sefer Yetzirah letter combination powers, is because then we might be able to say that the mishkan is a golem. If you can make a golem calf, maybe you can make a golem building. Okay, so at this point in the rabbit hole, I had a choice to make. There's a lot more golem stuff that we could have talked about, including a halachic ruling from the Chacham Tzvi about whether a golem can count in a minyan. If you want to hear more about that in a future episode, please let me know in the comments. But this Rishima about God's thought versus human thought sent me in another direction. As I mentioned before, this Rishima goes through a lot of different examples of things that could challenge this idea that human thought doesn't have the power to directly affect the physical world. And one of those is the idea of someone who can read other people's thoughts, because then somebody could use their mind to tell someone else to do things, and that would be an example of thought causing an effect in the physical world.
Circle. Close, but definitely wrong. Okay.
And the Rebbe cites a source there. So I followed that to a Hasidic work by Isaac Hummeler, who was a Chassid of the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad, where he explains the mechanics of how telepathy works. This is what he says there. There's a type of chachma, wisdom, or skill, that allows a person to know the thoughts of another person, and that it's famously known that Baal Shem Tov and the Arizal had this ability. But, he says, in his time, there are even much less holy people who are said to also possess this ability. And then he explains how it works. First, the chacham, the wise person, connects themselves with the soul of the thinker, the second person. And once that connection is made, and it's a good solid connection, then the chacham can extend or project themselves to the place where the thinker is and can look around. And through that projection, they can feel and perceive all of the thoughts of the thinker. Okay, so very cool. What was particularly fascinating to me was that this didn't sound like regular, ordinary, run-of-the-mill mind reading. The ability to know another person's thoughts that's described here actually seems like a secondary ability that stems from the real main ability, which is to make a direct soul-to-soul connection. And then through that, all sorts of cool stuff can happen. So that's very fun. Of course, this all has very little to do with Betzalel and the Mishkan, but hey, that's how the rabbit hole works. But now let's get back to Betzalel. If you remember, at the very beginning of all of this, we looked at a Gemara that talked about how Moshe reversed the order of the instructions that he got from God, and Betzalel was able to figure out what God really said.
Reverse the order, and what do you have?
And then the Gemara jumped to another Betzalel fun fact, and it told us about how he had Sefer Yetzirah letter combination powers. So while I was digging around for stuff about the letter combination thing, I found an explanation from Toldos Yaakov Yosef, which is an early Hasidic work by a student of the Baal Shem Tov, which pulls both of these ideas together in a way that I thought was really, really cool. He asks two questions. First of all, why would Moshe Rabbeinu mix up the order in the first place? And secondly, what does that instruction reversal story have to do with Betzalel's letter combination creation powers? So there's a concept in the Talmud called Ein Mukdam U'Me'ucher B'Torah. There is no earlier and later in the Torah. This concept is normally understood as meaning that the Torah is not always in chronological order, and it's used to explain some confusing story placement. But Toldos Yaakov Yosef explains that according to the Kabbalists, this idea means that the Torah is not written in its true order, because if it was, then somebody could use it to create the heavens and the earth and to destroy it. In other words, ein mukdam u'ma'ocher b'Torah, there's no earlier or later in the Torah is all jumbled up a little bit, is because in its true order, the text of the Torah would be the exact combination of letters needed to create and destroy worlds.
The power of letters, not just to create, but to kill.
Then he continues and says that he thinks that this is why Moshe switched the order, because that's what he always did with the entire Torah to prevent it from being used to build and destroy worlds. So, then you might have a question. If that's the case, then when Betzalel figured out the right order, he was basically disabling a very important safety feature. So, Toldos Yaakov Yosef concludes, that's why the Gemara tells us that Betzalel already knew how to combine the letters through which the heavens and earth were created. It wasn't something that was new to him. He didn't disable the safety feature. He already knew it, and he needed to know it, because the building of the Mishkan was literally an act of creation, and was part of the creation, as in the creation of the world, because until the Mishkan was built, the world was in a state of turbulence. And that's why Betzalel needed to know the order of the combinations used for the creation of the heavens and the earth. Because when he built the Mishkan, it was actually kind of like finishing off creation. So according to this, Betzalel's Sefer Yetzirah Golem powers aren't just a fun fact. It's telling us something important about the nature of the building of the Mishkan itself, that it was a part of the creation of the world, and that Betzalel's extraordinary creative abilities allowed him to participate in that. But there's something else that I take away from this explanation. I mentioned in the very first Parshah rabbit hole that I would warn you when I was making stuff up, so consider this your warning. So if the Torah is deliberately written out of order, because its true order would give us the ability to create and destroy worlds, then every time we find something puzzling or confusing in Torah, something that's not in order for us, and then we figure out an answer, we answer that question, we're essentially putting the Torah back in its true order by making sense of it. Which would mean, according to what we said before, every time we do that, we're unlocking secret Sefer Yetzirah Golem powers. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, if you have any questions or if you want to tell us about something that I missed, please put it in the comments. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. If you can't find the way out, try creating a way out through the combination of letters.